Okay, I just want to preface this by saying I know this isn't a super controversial take anymore by like modern gaming standards, but I just want to put forward really my case on why I personally think Assassin's Creed 3 is underrated and probably nowhere near as bad as people like to remember it to be. Okay, I am a huge fan of the OG Assassin's Creed series, not so much of the newer stuff. Like I honestly probably died off a little bit after Syndicate and all that kind of stuff. Just the point I was at in life, combined with the fact the games are probably going quite off-piste from where they were at the time, just led me to not really play the newer ones as much. But you know, 1, 2, Brotherhood, Revelations, I played the absolute shit out of, and going into 3, I was super hyped. And I personally was in the minority of not being let down by the game. Maybe my expectations at the time weren't high, which is why I wasn't disappointed. Or maybe it's a case of, you know, I was just a fanboy and was going to like it regardless. It's also, you know, perfectly possible. You know, in my opinion, AC3 is almost one of the GOATs of the series. Like, it really does set such a precedent going forward and implements so many things that defines the Assassin's Creed series going forward. And, you know, I can see why people didn't like it. It was a real change from the Altair and Ezio trilogies, or trilogy and Altair, I guess, of, you know, going from this charismatic Italian Ezio, you know, who was a lover and a fighter and just a real, like I said, real charismatic guy that you could really like as a player, to this really stoic Connor character. And I'm gonna butcher it, but I'm gonna go and try and pronounce his real name. It's Ratahanaken, maybe. Yeah, we'll call him Connor for the sake of the video. But you know, you go to this real stoic, plain-faced, very says it as it comes, angry Connor, which is a real change from the real charismatic character we had before. And I know Altair probably wasn't really the same level as Ezio, but you know, I think it's hard to compare 1 to 2 and the trilogy, just because it's such a, it's not a different game, but it's you know, 1 sets the groundwork, and a lot of people, I think, consider the Ezio trilogy as really the start of the story-based side of Assassin's Creed. You know, not to say Altair didn't have a story, but he really was just laying groundwork that entire first game. Now, there were so many things that AC3 introduced from a gameplay standpoint. You know, probably the biggest one going forward is naval warfare. That was really never before seen at this point in gaming. And I think you have to look at it and go, that was a real, not necessarily a risk, because if it didn't pay off, it was very low risk, high reward. If it flopped as a gameplay mechanic, it was kind of such a minute thing of the game that it didn't really matter. But as a mechanic that was introduced and it worked so well, you know, people were so excited, and it was really the majority of the reason that AC4 came along in the way it did and was such a success, was because AC3 introduced that groundwork. You know, not only that, did they introduce this whole new engine and new fighting mechanics and stealth mechanics and gameplay mechanics and interaction, and it really laid so much groundwork to create this just incredible game that, honestly, I know it's controversial, but I really think AC3 defines so much of Assassin's Creed. Now, I can see why people don't like it. Don't get me wrong. I'm well aware of AC's flaws. The start of the game is such a slow burner. You know, you start as Haytham for the first... Man, in my head, it was like 2 or 3 hours of gameplay, but doing research for this video, people say it was like 6-7 hours. To me, it didn't feel that long, and it's been a while since I last fully replayed it, but maybe it is genuinely that long. But you start the story for the first few hours playing as Haytham, who you without really too much into it, you would just kind of assume he's the main character. He's the main assassin in the game. And you meet all these characters, Charles Lee, Thomas Hickey, and all these other guys that you just think are your fellow assassins and all that kind of stuff. And you think they're the good guys, and you play the whole game with this in mind. And then you get to this huge twist at the time. And I remember like my jaw hitting the floor as this like bright-eyed, I don't know, I was like 14, 15 maybe at the time. I remember just my jaw hitting the floor and being shocked and all that kind of stuff about, oh my god, Haytham's a Templar. Like, how has this happened? You play this whole first 4 hours of the game thinking that you're playing the good guys, and all of a sudden you're the bad guys. It's like... So after this switch happens, it kind of rushes through the story of how Connor comes to be, let's just say. And then you start playing through Assassin's Creed 3 as Connor. And you start him as a child, and you play him through his childhood, through his young adulthood, and then you're finally unleashed into the world. At this point, you probably are like 6-7 hours into the game, where you're fully unleashed as this grown man. You're this grown Connor, Rohatted. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. And I really think this is a super important storytelling element. And I think it's criminally underrated that from a story perspective, with how well this was told, you become so aware of both sides of this story, which isn't really something you've seen up to this point in an Assassin's Creed game. You've really only ever seen the Assassin's side of things, and all of a sudden you're not sympathetic to the Templars, but you're looking at it going, oh my god, are we the bad guys? Now obviously you quickly snap back to reality and you know you're not, but it is this sudden revelation of going, maybe it isn't quite as simple as they're the good guys, we're the bad guys. There's so much more depth and story and all that kind of stuff to this game, and it just adds these layers of complexity that you didn't have prior to this. And of course, while all this is going on, you have the modern day stuff. Now, I always really enjoyed the modern day stuff. I know a lot of people didn't. Personally, I always enjoyed that element, and I think Assassin's Creed 3 took that to another level with adding depth to the story. It takes you to these amazing locations, places that you would never think to go to in Assassin's Creed 3 game, or Assassin's Creed game full stop, let alone you're going to like this boxing match, and I think it's like Brazil, Portugal or something like that, and then you're going to, traversing these skyscrapers in this New York City, and it's all these kind of things you don't expect from an Assassin's Creed game. All of a sudden you're there and you're playing it, and it's like, oh my god, this is such a take, such a contrast from in this case colonial America, but even from flipping the Ezio days and the Altair days. I can't even remember what years they were, but you get my point. It's this adds all this depth and all the weird, like, I want to call it mythology, but I don't know if you would necessarily call it mythology over the modern day story. I can see why people didn't like it. I was probably intrigued by it more than I was like captivated by it, but I enjoyed it. It was fun, and it added this element that I hadn't really played before. Now, one of the most fiercely underrated elements that I think a lot of people missed out on playing Assassin's Creed 3, which maybe is why I have this love for it that a lot of people don't, is the Homestead missions. And man, it's so dumb that it was optional content. Like, I understand why it was optional content, but at the same time, if it was made part of the core game and maybe even expanded on a little bit, like, it would have been a totally different game. It develops Connor, and it develops the characters around him and in his world so much, and it's unbelievable how much it shapes and forms your opinion of Connor and the world around him. It's shocking to me that this seems to be not played by a lot of people. It builds Connor's character, and it really defines his values and shapes the whole landscape around him in this homestead. And it's nice, wholesome for the most part gameplay, and it really helps you connect with Connor. And I really think this is that not being a core part of the game. I think that's a lot of why people don't gel with Connor as a character in the same way they did with Ezio. And you have to remember, you're coming off of a game and a series that was in such a good, strong place with Ezio. There's such a different character in Connor, and you really, really needed that fundamental storytelling element that just wasn't there in the base I'm going to call it base, even though it wasn't the base game. It wasn't in the, you know, compulsory, let's call it, story. And it really helps you get involved in this world in such a way that you don't necessarily feel in a lot of modern games, I feel like. And even characters like Achilles that normally I think you would maybe just blow off as a side character almost. You know, there's such a love-hate relationship with him that Connor has that you feel is the player. And sometimes you're frustrated at Connor that he's not more loving towards Achilles, who's basically given him his whole life back. But it's such a human feeling connection, and it's really, really, really crucial to building this game into what it is. That's kind of the fundamentals of why I think Assassin's Creed 3 is probably overlooked as genuinely one of the coolest games in the series. I think all of that aside, it's in a really awesome setting in colonial America. I know technically I'm fighting my guys. You know, my guys are the bad guys in this game, which isn't an element I've seen as a Brit before, really, that much. Even though history tells us as the villain quite often. I feel like genuinely it's not something you see a lot of in gaming, and it was cool to see that dynamic. And, you know, just all the elements that this added in ship battles and the new fighting mechanics and stealth mechanics. A lot of the missions were very boring and very samey, and these like stealth missions where you had to crouch in a friggin' field and overhear some guards talking about this random plot line. And there is a lot of that, and there is a very slow burn game, but towards the end it really builds, and it really builds itself into this game that I genuinely think is one of the greatest in the series. And I love Assassin's Creed. I'm a self-confessed Assassin's Creed fanatic, and it really pains me to see them take that element away, I feel like, in the newer games, and it's really harder to gel with the characters in the same way that, for me at least, it was easy to gel with Connor in Assassin's Creed 3. And that is kind of the fundamentals. This isn't a deep dive video in any way, but that's kind of the fundamentals and why I think AC3 is massively overlooked. And I'm intrigued to know your opinion, so please let me know in the comments below what you think of AC3 and what you think of the series as a whole going into, oh my god, the name is Shadows in a few weeks' time, which I'm excited to play. It seems like it could be a return to form almost. I think off the back of Mirage, which was a reasonable success for Ubisoft. I'm excited to check that out. So thank you very much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.